Story 2. Cabin Door That Wouldn't Close. I had rented a small, weathered cabin deep in the mountains, the kind that looked inviting in pictures, but carried a sense of isolation I hadn't fully appreciated until I drove up the narrow, twisting dirt road that led to it. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and earth, heavy from the rain that had started earlier in the afternoon, and the forest around the cabin seemed alive, dense and silent in a way that made every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves feel loud and deliberate. I had been craving solitude, a weekend away from the city and its endless noise, but as I unpacked my bag and stepped inside, the silence of the cabin settled over me like a weight I hadn't expected. The walls were rough-hewn, the wood dark and slightly damp, and I could hear the faint groan of the structure as it shifted with the wind outside. I told myself it was charming, rustic even, though an unease had already begun to creep up my spine. The first night, the storm hit hard. The wind whipped through the trees, rattling the windows and causing the old roof to moan in long, mournful groans. I lit a small lantern in the main room, trying to anchor myself with its dim, flickering light. That's when I noticed the door leading to the back porch refused to latch. I could swear I had shut it tight, twisting the old bolt until it clicked, but when I returned from checking on the lantern, the door was slightly ajar. The hinges creaking faintly as if the wind itself had pried it open. I closed it again, pressing my hand against the cold wood, and thought maybe it was warped from the humidity, or perhaps the wind had forced it open. I didn't think much of it at first, but then came the noises, the subtle creaks and sighs of the house that didn't match the storm outside. The floorboards whispered under my weight, and sometimes it sounded as if someone, or something, was moving just beyond the edges of my lantern's glow. By around 2 in the morning, my curiosity had become dread. I had been lying awake, listening to the storm hammering against the cabin, when I heard it, faint, unintelligible whispers from just beyond that stubborn door. They weren't words I recognized, but the cadence was human, deliberate. I froze, my chest tight, convinced I was imagining it. But the whispers persisted, low and hushed, moving in irregular patterns as though someone were pacing. I pressed my ear to the door, the wood icy against my cheek, and could hear the faint scrape of nails against the floorboards. My stomach turned and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise, every nerve alive with a terror I couldn't explain. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but the slow, deliberate pacing didn't match anything I'd ever known in the forest. I gathered my courage and slowly cracked the door open, the lantern light spilling across the wooden porch. Nothing. Just the forest beyond, rain dripping from the eaves, trees swaying like ghostly sentinels in the storm. I stepped onto the porch, ears straining for the faintest sound, but there was nothing. No movement, no whisper, only the steady, hollow thrum of the wind. I went back inside, heart hammering, and tried to convince myself that I had simply been on edge, that the storm and isolation were bending my perception. But that night, and every night after, the door would act the same. No matter how tightly I latched it, it would be ajar in the early hours, creaking and whispering in ways that made my blood run cold. As the weekend wore on, the unease grew heavier. I began noticing small things. My boots weren't always where I left them. The firewood stacked neatly near the door, sometimes disturbed, as if someone had shuffled through it in the dark. Even outside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest itself seemed to press in on me, shadows in the storm taking shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus. I walked the narrow trail leading from the cabin, hoping the exposure would ease my nerves, but the trees closed in like walls, and the sound of wind and rain mixed with something else, something faint, patient, deliberate. I would freeze mid-step, straining to hear a whisper, a footstep, a scrape against bark, only to find the hollow silence of the forest had returned. The nights were worse. I would lie awake, lanterns casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls, listening to the house itself. It moaned, creaked and whispered, but there was intention behind it, a rhythm I couldn't place. At times, I could hear what I thought were muffled voices moving through the cabin, never fully intelligible, just the cadence of human speech, low and hushed. The door would swing slightly in the storm, the lock rattling faintly as though pushed from the other side. I would sit on the edge of the bed, heart hammering, listening to the scraping of nails or the faint shuffle of footsteps, willing the night to end. Every time I opened the door, the forest stretched empty before me, but the feeling of being watched never left. I began to dread stepping outside. Even for a few moments, the air felt heavier, charged with a presence I couldn't name. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't have, and I often caught glimpses of shapes at the edge of the clearing, human-like but shifting, as if they were not quite solid. I told myself to leave, to get in my truck and drive back to the safety of the main road, but each time I approached the door, the whispers would rise in pitch and intensity, faintly echoing in my mind even before the wind carried them. I slept little, snatching moments of uneasy rest with the lantern burning beside me, afraid to close my eyes completely. On the final night, the storm intensified. The wind howled, rain lashing against the cabin, and I could hear the relentless creaking of the back door. I pressed my hand against it, feeling the vibration of each whisper, each scrape, and for a moment I considered leaving in the middle of the night. But the thought of stepping into the rain, into the forest I had come to fear, made my limbs heavy with dread. I listened for hours, until dawn began to lighten the sky, revealing the soaked trees and the hollowed ground. Exhausted, I finally dozed in brief fits, haunted by the constant low hum of whispers that seemed to follow me into sleep. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, avoiding the back door, and drove down the winding road with my hands shaking. The forest loomed silently behind me, still dense and wet, and I could feel it pressing against the windows of my truck, as if the cabin itself had sent some lingering part of the storm along with me. I told myself I would never return. I left the cabin behind, but the memory of that door, the whispers, and the deliberate movements in the dark followed me down every road. At night, when the wind rustles against the windows and branches scrape along the siding, I can still hear it, a soft, patient whisper, just beyond reach, just beyond understanding. Even in my own home, miles away from the mountains, the memory lingers. I avoid cabins in the woods, stay on well-lit paths, and keep my doors locked, yet there are times when I hear a faint creak, or a whisper that carries no meaning but fills me with the same unease I felt that weekend. It's not terror in the sudden sense. It's the slow, relentless awareness that the forest, the cabin, the hollow, they remember, they notice, they wait. And though I escaped that cabin, the echoes of it never truly left me. The storm, the door that wouldn't close, the whispers, they have a way of following you, soft and persistent, leaving a weight in your chest and a doubt in your mind that you were ever really safe at all. Even now, if I find myself alone, especially when rain taps against the windows and wind rattles the walls, I press my hand to the door and wonder if some part of that cabin is still waiting, still watching, still whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. I don't know what it wanted or why it lingered in that way, but I know I won't ever return to the mountains alone. And some nights, when the wind moves through the trees just so, I swear I can hear it. The same soft scraping, the same low whispers, reminding me that the cabin door never truly closed, and maybe it never will. Story 3. The Tree by the Old Creek. I grew up hearing about the tree by the creek, the one people in the hollow whispered about during storms, the one they said you didn't go near after dark. They spoke of it in quiet tones, as if the words themselves could summon whatever lingered there, and I had always laughed at the stories, chalking them up to old-timers trying to scare kids. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at you, persistent and insistent, and one night, when a storm rolled in heavy and wild, I felt it tug me down the muddy trail that led to the creek. The rain came in sheets, soaking my coat and plastering my hair to my forehead. The trail was slick with mud, roots slick as snakes, but something inside me insisted I keep going. I could hear the creek before I saw it, the water swollen and thrashing against rocks, a roaring undercurrent that seemed alive, as though it carried voices just beneath its surface. When I finally reached the clearing, the tree was there, just as the stories described, its limbs twisted and gnarled, clawing at the stormy sky like arthritic fingers, roots sprawling in chaotic angles across the wet ground. Something about it felt wrong, an unease that crawled up my spine and made the hairs on my arms bristle. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something coppery and sharp that made my stomach twist. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that perhaps the old stories weren't all exaggeration. I stepped closer. Boots sinking into the mud, and the wind gusted through the branches, making the limbs writhe in a way that seemed almost alive, almost conscious. I thought I saw a figure huddled at the base of the tree, crouched low as if hiding. I called out, voice cracking, and silence answered me. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. My heart was hammering, and I felt the first real stab of fear. An awareness that this was not just a prank or a trick of the mind. I inched forward, the creek roaring behind me, mud sucking at my boots, and then lightning split the sky. For a moment, the world was painted in harsh white light, and I saw a face in the bark itself. It was twisted and leering, eyes hollow and black, mouth frozen in a sneer. I blinked, and it was gone. The bark just bark again, wet and warped. I stumbled back, slipping in the mud, my heart racing as though it would tear itself free of my chest. I turned and ran, slipping again and again, barely keeping my footing on the slick trail. The creek's roar chased me, drowning out the storm in my ears, and I felt the sensation of being watched, of something moving in the shadows just beyond the trees. Every branch looked like a hand reaching for me, every shape a crouched figure. I didn't look back, not even once. And when I finally broke through the last of the forest and reached the relative safety of the road, my lungs burned and I was shaking uncontrollably. The tree, the figure, the face, it was all burned into my memory in a way that refused to fade. Even years later, the memory lingers. I can't hear the sound of a creek running during a storm without feeling that same panic clawing up my throat. I dream of that tree sometimes, of its limbs scraping the sky, of the metallic smell of the mud and the air, and of that leering face that vanished too quickly for me to understand, but too clearly to ever forget. I wonder what it wanted, or if it had been waiting for me, as if storms themselves were a signal, a call to come closer and see. I never went back to that creek after dark. I never will. Story 4. Storm Lantern. Shadows. The storm came without warning, rolling over the mountains in heavy, dark clouds that swallowed the sky and left the forest in a sudden, suffocating darkness. I had been hiking alone, hoping for the solitude the mountains promised, when the first fat drops began to fall, splattering the trail and soaking the leaves beneath my feet. The wind picked up quickly, bending the trees and whipping my coat against my back. and I realized I was miles from the nearest road, unprepared for anything more than a light drizzle. The trail grew slick, roots jutting out like jagged teeth in the mud, and I could hear the distant roar of water in the creek below, carried on the wind like a low, constant warning. I pushed forward, trying to find shelter before the storm fully broke, and then I saw it. A small, abandoned shack, half hidden in a tangle of overgrown brush and leaning precariously against the slope of the hill. Relief hit me in a physical rush as I stumbled toward it, mud clinging to my boots and pants. The door was unlatched, hanging slightly crooked on rusty hinges, and I pushed it open with a trembling hand. The interior smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't place. Something sharp and coppery that made my stomach tighten. I dropped my pack and struck a match, lighting the old lantern I had packed for emergencies. Its pale, flickering glow filled the room, casting long, restless shadows across the walls. The furniture was minimal: a rough table, a couple of chairs, and a bed frame with a torn mattress. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized some shapes in the corners of the room didn't belong to anything solid. They moved just at the edge of the light, subtle flickers that vanished when I tried to focus on them, as if they were conscious of being watched. I told myself it was the storm, the wind making the shadows dance, a trick of the lantern's flicker on peeling paint and warped boards, but the sound didn't lie. I could hear it moving, brushing lightly against the walls, soft enough to almost be mistaken for breathing. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding rain, and the sound would retreat just enough to make me wonder if it had ever been there at all. Every so often, I thought I caught glimpses of a figure, crouched or leaning, never fully visible but close enough that my pulse spiked and my hands shook. I kept the lantern between me and the shapes, as though the thin circle of light were the only thing protecting me from whatever lingered in that room. Hours passed in that half-light, the storm outside relentless, each clap of thunder shaking the shack like it might collapse. I sat crouched on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, trying to tell myself it was just the forest playing tricks, just the wind and the rain exaggerating every movement and sound. But the scraping, soft and deliberate, never left. It followed me when I dared to step outside for a moment, retreating into the shadows as though the storm itself were a barrier. I could feel it in the air, a presence patient and aware, lingering just beyond the reach of sight. Even the trees seemed to bow toward the shack, branches thrashing and scraping together, adding to the impression that the forest was watching, listening, waiting. I tried to make sense of it, thought perhaps it was another hiker, someone seeking shelter like me. But no footprints marked the muddy trail, no human voice spoke above the rain. The storm was all-consuming, but the noises inside and just outside the shack felt separate, alive in a way the wind and rain were not. My lantern's light flickered with each gust of wind, shadows stretching and twisting along the walls, forming shapes I didn't want to name. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of how still the world beyond the door had become, as if the storm and the forest had conspired to create a pocket of unnatural quiet, and inside that pocket something was moving. Time lost meaning. I could no longer tell how long I had crouched there, listening to the relentless rain, the wind clawing at the structure, and the subtle, deliberate movements that never fully revealed themselves. My body ached, my fingers cramped from gripping the lantern too tightly, but fear held me in place. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape. But the thought of stepping into the storm felt equally perilous. Each time I dared a glance toward the door or the corners of the shack, the shadows recoiled, retreating just enough to maintain the illusion that I was not alone, that I was being observed. By the time dawn finally began to lighten the sky, the storm easing slightly, exhaustion had set into my bones. I had been awake and alert for hours, my mind taut with fear, every nerve straining to hear the softest sound. The forest around the shack looked no different from the day before, rain slick and wet, but the memory of the shadows and the subtle, deliberate noises remained as vivid as the storm itself. I left the shack quietly, trying not to make a sound, stepping carefully over the mud and roots, and I didn't look back. The moment I cleared the brush and saw the road beyond, I allowed myself to breathe, slow and deliberate, though the fear did not leave me. Even after I returned home, far from the mountains and the creek, the memory lingered. I can hear the sound of a storm and immediately feel the tension in my chest, the subtle awareness that someone or something is just beyond the light, waiting, patient, deliberate. I sometimes imagine the lantern's glow, the way it carved a fragile circle of safety in the dark, and I remember the shapes that retreated just out of reach, and I realize I'll never forget them. They weren't monsters in the fantastical sense. They weren't creatures from a storybook. They were real in a different way, an unseen presence that could move in the half-light, brushing just beyond the boundaries of perception, unidentifiable, yet undeniable. I have returned to the mountains since that night, always in daylight, always with others, but I never approach the trail that leads to that shack. Even now, when a storm sweeps over the hills, I feel it, the same brush of presence, the same subtle shift of shadows at the edges of my vision. It is not something I can name or confront, only acknowledge, and the acknowledgement carries with it a cold, lingering fear that settles in my chest and refuses to leave. The lantern's glow and the shadows it revealed remain burned into my memory, a permanent reminder that some things in the forest are patient, deliberate, and waiting, and that curiosity, even when tempered by caution, can bring you closer than you ever intended to the unknown. Sometimes I wonder if the shack was abandoned at all, or if it was simply waiting, like the forest itself, to remind travelers that the mountains have ways of keeping secrets, and that even in the light of day, those secrets leave an imprint. The storm, the lantern, the shadows, all of it hangs in my mind, quiet and persistent, a reminder that the mountains are old, that the forest watches, and that some encounters leave traces long after you've escaped them. Even now, years later, I can feel it when storms roll in. I hear the rain hammering against the roof, the wind scraping against trees, and I remember crouching in that shack, lantern clutched in my hands, listening to the world hold its breath around me. The shadows never left. They didn't follow me exactly, but they stayed, tucked into the corners of memory, flickering in the dark, reminding me that the mountains have long memories, and sometimes so do the places we seek for solitude. Story 5. The Howl on Raven Ridge. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering the windshield and drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof of my old truck as I drove through Raven Ridge. The road was narrow and winding, slick with mud and fallen leaves, and the trees leaned in close, their branches thrashing in the wind like the arms of something alive. At first I only noticed the storm, the roar of water rushing in the gullies, the deep rumble of thunder rolling across the valley, the occasional flash of lightning that turned the forest into a world of stark, jagged shadows. But then I heard it, a long, low howl that carried across the ridge, cutting through the storm with a clarity that made my stomach twist. My first thought was wolf, maybe a stray animal caught in the wind and rain, but the sound had a weight, a deliberateness that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever known. I slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tighter, listening. The howl came again, rising and falling in long, measured tones that seemed almost intelligent, almost purposeful. I glanced at the cliffs lining the road, slick and dark under the storm, and in the brief glare of a lightning strike, I thought I saw something moving along the edges. Human-shaped, hunched or leaning, but gone before my eyes fully adjusted. I blinked, and the ridge was empty, the rocks slick and inert. My heart was hammering, and I tried to tell myself it was just the storm. Just shadows playing tricks in the wet, chaotic light. But the sound didn't lie. It was out there, somewhere, following me, or maybe waiting. The road twisted down into the valley, and with every turn the howling seemed to follow, moving with me across the wind and rain. I told myself it was impossible. That sound doesn't move like that naturally. But each time I checked the mirrors or glanced toward the cliffs, I could swear I saw figures. Tall, shadowed forms that vanished the instant I tried to focus on them. The howl grew louder as I descended, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a tight pressure crawling up my spine. My hands were slick on the wheel, knuckles white from gripping so hard, but I couldn't stop. Couldn't slow down too much on the treacherous road. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the ridge in stark white light. For a brief moment I saw them clearly, or thought I did. Hunched shapes crouched on the rock edges, motionless, watching. I blinked, and they were gone, swallowed by the darkness and rain. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my pulse, and the howl answered with a long, low wail that seemed to echo directly in my skull. My stomach twisted, and I realized that the sound was closer now, following me more directly, as if moving down the ridge at my pace, just out of sight. I forced my eyes forward, focusing on the slick road, the double yellow line barely visible beneath the water running in rivulets. The headlights flickered in the sheets of rain, illuminating twisted tree trunks and slick rock faces, but nothing moved within the reach of the beams. Yet I felt it, heavy and deliberate, watching, tracking. The howl came again, low and guttural, and I swore it paused whenever I slowed, almost as if it were taunting me, testing me. My pulse raced and every instinct screamed to stop, to turn around and drive back the way I came. But the thought of slowing down on the ridge, letting whatever it was catch up, made my legs tremble. The descent felt endless. Each curve revealed another flash of movement along the cliff edges, brief, human-shaped silhouettes that vanished the instant my eyes found them. I caught glimpses of crouched forms, leaning out from behind wet rocks, shifting with the storm as though aware I was looking. The howl answered each flash, a long, low sound that filled the valley, resonating through my chest and making the hairs on my arms stand up. It was patient, deliberate, like a predator tracking its prey, but not entirely animal. I told myself I was imagining it, that exhaustion and the storm were conspiring to warp my perception, but the feeling of being followed was undeniable, an oppressive presence pressing down even through the roar of rain and wind. At one point, the road narrowed to a hairpin curve, the drop to the valley below disappearing into black water and trees. I had to slow almost to a crawl, mud splashing against the tires, and the howl came again, rising with a cadence that made my teeth chatter. I caught another figure on the cliff, hunched, unmoving, almost blended into the rock, and it seemed to lean toward me as the lightning struck. I slammed my eyes shut and forced my foot on the gas. Heart hammering, tires spinning slightly in the slick mud, praying the descent would end before I lost control. Eventually, I reached the bottom of the ridge, the valley road opening into a stretch of familiar asphalt. Relief hit me in waves, but the howl didn't leave. Even as I drove through the lowlands, headlights cutting through the storm, I could hear it faintly in the wind, echoing from the ridge behind me, lingering in my chest. My pulse slowly began to settle, but every nerve in my body remained taut. The sense of being followed, of watched, didn't fade, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see shapes crouched in the shadows along the tree line. When I finally reached home, soaked and trembling, I pulled into the garage and shut the doors, heart hammering. The howl was gone, at least for the moment, but the memory of it pressed down on me with a weight I couldn't shake. Nights since, whenever storms roll over the mountains or wind rattles against the windows, I hear it again. The low, deliberate sound carried in the distance, echoing in my mind like a ghost of that night on Raven Ridge. It is never loud enough to be certain, never close enough to confront, but it is there. Patient and persistent, a reminder that the ridge still remembers me, still watches, still follows in its own way. Even years later, I avoid that road during storms, sticking to lower valleys and main highways, but the sound never truly leaves. Sometimes when thunder cracks overhead and rain lashes the roof, I close my eyes and swear I can hear the howl, low and deliberate, echoing in the distance just beyond reach. It is a sound that lingers, that presses into the chest, that reminds me the ridge, and whatever haunts it, are patient. It doesn't need to chase. It only waits. And I remember that night every time the mountains rumble, every time lightning splits the sky. And the memory of those human-shaped silhouettes crouched along the cliff edges rises, vanishing before my eyes, leaving only the echo of the howl, the storm, and the persistent, unshakable dread that it could return at any moment. I have driven that ridge since, always in daylight, always with others, and the forest feels ordinary again. Just trees, just rocks, just the wind in the branches. But when a storm moves in, and the wind bends the trees into unnatural angles, I feel that presence again, a subtle, deliberate weight pressing against the senses, a whisper of the howl that carries across the valley in my mind. It is never more than a memory, yet it lingers, alive, patient, deliberate. Even when I am safe in my home. Miles from the ridge the sound stays, a reminder that some nights, some storms and some places in Appalachia never truly let go. The first few times I tried to rationalize it, I told myself it was wolves, or deer, or the wind moving in strange ways through the rocks and trees. But no animal makes a sound like that, slow and measured, intelligent in its rhythm. I realized eventually that the ridge itself held that memory, that the cliffs and trees, the mud and the storm were capable of holding a presence, a watchful awareness that I had crossed into unknowable territory. I will never drive Raven Ridge during a storm again. I haven't, and yet, every time the wind rises, every time rain lashes the roof, I hear it, the low, deliberate howl, a sound that does not belong entirely to this world, but is real enough to make me remember, shiver, and sit in silence, knowing it is waiting, patient and deliberate, just beyond the reach of sight. Story 6. The phone line in the storm. The storm came sudden and furious that night, ripping through the mountains with a violence that made the old house shiver and groan. I had lived in that cabin long enough to know the mountains had moods, but this was different. The wind tore at the eaves, rattling the shutters and shaking the thin glass in the windows. Rain pounded against the roof, hammering a relentless rhythm that drowned out nearly every other sound. I lit a few candles and huddled near the fireplace, feeling the heat do little to chase away the chill that crept up my spine. That's when I picked up the old landline phone, the kind with the curly cord and yellowed plastic, to check messages. The storm had knocked out power, and the phone was the only line of connection to the outside world, if it still worked. The dial tone was faint, warped by static, and when I listened closely I thought I heard voices. Soft, urgent, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. My first thought was a crossed line, some distant neighbor calling through a storm surge, but the voices persisted, low and insistent, threading through the static in a way that made my teeth ache with unease. I leaned closer to the receiver, heart hammering, and I swear I heard the words clearly. sometimes calling my name, sometimes repeating the same syllables over and over, strange, syllabic rhythms that were neither English nor any language I'd ever heard. The receiver felt heavier in my hand, rattling as if it had a life of its own. I tried to hang up, to drop the phone back in its cradle, but it resisted. The cord rattled against the edge of the table, vibrating as though something were pulling at the other end. Each clap of thunder seemed to mask a new whisper, and I could feel it pressing in from all directions, the storm outside now feeling impossibly heavy, like the air itself carried weight, and the house was being crushed under it. Shadows from the fireplace danced across the walls, elongated and twitching with each flash of lightning, but there was something else moving at the edges of my vision, something faint and deliberate that I could not place. I told myself it was the storm, that the voices were my imagination, carried along the old lines and wires in a way that made them seem alive, but every so often a whisper would cut through, calling my name with a precision that made me flinch. I felt eyes on me, though I saw nothing in the dim light. The phone rattled again, harder this time, and I set it down with a trembling hand, leaving it off the hook, hoping that if I didn't touch it, the voices would stop. They didn't. They persisted faintly, woven into the sound of rain on the roof, the groan of timber against wind, until I couldn't tell if I was hearing them or imagining them. The night stretched on in a slow, suffocating crawl. I moved through the cabin, checking windows and doors, trying to convince myself that there was nothing beyond the walls that could reach me. The storm roared and groaned, and each time lightning split the sky, I saw the shadows twist in unnatural ways, sometimes stretching like fingers along the walls, other times pooling in the corners like dark water. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak and pop of the old house made me jump. Every gust of wind a sharp reminder that the world outside had no regard for my safety. The phone sat on the table, cord curling across the wood like a living thing, and I avoided it, eyes flicking toward it constantly, heart hammering. By morning, the storm had abated, leaving the mountains slick and dripping, the air heavy with the scent of wet pine and soil. I did not touch the phone that day, nor the next. Weeks passed, and I avoided it altogether, leaving it off the hook and unplugged whenever I could. I tried to rationalize the whispers, crossed lines, interference, my own mind playing tricks in the isolation of the mountains. But even after the storm faded into memory, the sensation lingered. When wind rattles the windows now, I can almost hear the whispers again, soft, urgent, calling through the static of some unseen line, carrying a weight that the mountains themselves seem to know. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had answered, if I had let the voices carry their message fully. The thought chills me, because I have never been able to understand what they wanted. Not a single word made sense, yet the insistence was deliberate, patient, almost knowing. I can still feel the weight of that night pressing down on my chest, the way the storm seemed to fold the cabin into itself, making the house smaller and the air thicker. The phone became more than an object. It became a conduit, a reminder that even in isolation, the mountains have ways of reaching inside, of whispering across time and space in a way the human mind cannot grasp. I have lived in other houses since then, further from the mountains, further from the wild isolation that made that storm so palpable. And yet, when the wind rises against the windows, when a storm rolls in heavy and sudden, I hear it again, the faint, urgent whisper, carrying across the memory of wires and static, calling in a language I cannot understand. It is a memory that is alive, and in some strange, unshakable way, I feel it pressing down again, demanding attention, insisting I remember. The cabin, the storm, the phone, They were a single, inseparable experience that has left its mark in my mind, a shadow that lingers in every howl of wind and crack of thunder. Even now, when I pass by old houses with landlines or see wires strung across trees and poles, I feel the weight of that night, the storm, the whispers, the pressing heaviness of the mountains. They remain with me. I have not touched another landline like that since, and I do not plan to. Some things in the mountains are patient. Some things wait until the right conditions, the right storm, to speak again. And I have learned that it is wiser to listen with caution, to remember, and to keep certain doors, whether of cabins or phone lines, closed, lest the whispers find a way back in. Story 7. The Shadow Beneath the Bridge. The storm came sudden and furious that night, ripping through the mountains with a violence that made the old house shiver and groan. I had lived in that cabin long enough to know the mountains had moods, but this was different. The wind tore at the eaves, rattling the shutters and shaking the thin glass in the windows. Rain pounded against the roof, hammering a relentless rhythm that drowned out nearly every other sound. I lit a few candles and huddled near the fireplace, feeling the heat do little to chase away the chill that crept up my spine. That's when I picked up the old landline phone, the kind with the curly cord and yellowed plastic, to check messages. The storm had knocked out power, and the phone was the only line of connection to the outside world, if it still worked. The dial tone was faint, warped by static, and when I listened closely, I thought I heard voices. Soft, urgent, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. My first thought was a crossed line, some distant neighbor calling through a storm surge, but the voices persisted, low and insistent, threading through the static in a way that made my teeth ache with unease. I leaned closer to the receiver, heart hammering, and I swear I heard the words clearly, sometimes calling my name, sometimes repeating the same syllables over and over, strange, syllabic rhythms that were neither English nor any language I'd ever heard. The receiver felt heavier in my hand, rattling as if it had a life of its own. I tried to hang up, to drop the phone back in its cradle, but it resisted. The cord rattled against the edge of the table, vibrating as though something were pulling at the other end. Each clap of thunder seemed to mask a new whisper, and I could feel it pressing in from all directions, the storm outside now feeling impossibly heavy, like the air itself carried weight, and the house was being crushed under it. Shadows from the fireplace danced across the walls, elongated and twitching with each flash of lightning. But there was something else moving at the edges of my vision, something faint and deliberate that I could not place. I told myself it was the storm, that the voices were my imagination, carried along the old lines and wires in a way that made them seem alive, but every so often a whisper would cut through, calling my name with a precision that made me flinch. I felt eyes on me, though I saw nothing in the dim light. The phone rattled again, harder this time, and I set it down with a trembling hand, leaving it off the hook, hoping that if I didn't touch it, the voices would stop. They didn't. They persisted faintly, woven into the sound of rain on the roof, the groan of timber against wind, until I couldn't tell if I was hearing them or imagining them. The night stretched on in a slow, suffocating crawl. I moved through the cabin, checking windows and doors, trying to convince myself that there was nothing beyond the walls that could reach me. The storm roared and groaned, and each time lightning split the sky. I saw the shadows twist in unnatural ways, sometimes stretching like fingers along the walls, other times pooling in the corners like dark water. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak and pop of the old house made me jump, every gust of wind a sharp reminder that the world outside had no regard for my safety. The phone sat on the table, cord curling across the wood like a living thing, and I avoided it, eyes flicking toward it constantly, heart hammering. By morning, the storm had abated, leaving the mountains slick and dripping, the air heavy with the scent of wet pine and soil. I did not touch the phone that day, nor the next. Weeks passed, and I avoided it altogether, leaving it off the hook and unplugged whenever I could. I tried to rationalize the whispers, crossed lines, interference, my own mind playing tricks in the isolation of the mountains. But even after the storm faded into memory, the sensation lingered. When wind rattles the windows now, I can almost hear the whispers again, soft, urgent, calling through the static of some unseen line, carrying a weight that the mountains themselves seem to know. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had answered, if I had let the voices carry their message fully. The thought chills me because I have never been able to understand what they wanted. Not a single word made sense, yet the insistence was deliberate, patient, almost knowing. I can still feel the weight of that night pressing down on my chest, the way the storm seemed to fold the cabin into itself, making the house smaller and the air thicker. The phone became more than an object. It became a conduit, a reminder that even in isolation, the mountains have ways of reaching inside, of whispering across time and space in a way the human mind cannot grasp. I have lived in other houses since then, further from the mountains, further from the wild isolation that made that storm so palpable. And yet, when the wind rises against the windows, when a storm rolls in heavy and sudden, I hear it again, the faint, urgent whisper, carrying across the memory of wires and static, calling in a language I cannot understand. It is a memory that is alive, and in some strange, unshakable way, I feel it pressing down again, demanding attention, insisting I remember. The cabin, the storm, the phone, they were a single, inseparable experience that has left its mark in my mind, a shadow that lingers in every howl of wind and crack of thunder. Even now, when I pass by old houses with landlines or see wires strung across trees and poles, I feel the weight of that night. The storm, the whispers, the pressing heaviness of the mountains. They remain with me. I have not touched another landline like that since, and I do not plan to. Some things in the mountains are patient. Some things wait until the right conditions, the right storm, to speak again. And I have learned that it is wiser to listen with caution, to remember, and to keep certain doors, whether of cabins or phone lines, closed, lest the whispers find a way back in. Story 1. Lightning in the hollow. I remember the night the storm rolled in like a living thing, heavy and breathing, as though it were pressing down on the hollow itself. The sky was an endless black, the kind that swallows every shape and color, leaving only the twisted silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. I was driving my old truck down that narrow dirt road that wound through the heart of the hollow, the tires crunching over wet leaves and mud, the only light coming from the occasional blinding flash of lightning that split the sky and made the forest look suddenly alien. Each bolt revealed the world in stark, unforgiving detail, and in that starkness, I thought I saw shapes moving just beyond the tree line, quick, darting figures that melted into shadow when the light faded. My heart started to hammer in my chest, and I had to remind myself that it was just a trick of the lightning. Trees cast wild, dancing shadows, branches scraping together like the fingers of a blind man, and I tried to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The truck shuddered under me, coughing like it had its own sense of fear, and I realized I had to pull over. I killed the engine, and the hollow seemed to suck away every remaining sound of the storm, leaving me in a darkness so deep it pressed against my skin. That's when I heard it, the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on wet leaves behind me. My breath caught, and I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But the rhythm didn't match anything I had heard before. It was slow, cautious, deliberate, and it was coming closer. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, every nerve in my body screaming to get out, to drive, but my hands were frozen. My eyes strained in the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was there. But the hollow had swallowed everything, leaving only the sound of wet leaves shifting under something heavy and living. The storm seemed to change then, growing louder, not in a natural rhythm but in waves, like it was trying to cover up something. I could feel the tension in the air as a tangible weight pressing down on my chest, and I realized I was trembling, cold and shaking despite the sweat slicking my neck. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and the darkness beyond the headlights looked deeper, almost solid, as though the forest itself had thickened and gathered into a single shape. A sudden crack of lightning revealed a figure standing just past the tree line, tall, hunched, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. My stomach dropped. I blinked, and it was gone. Just the trees swaying like nothing had ever been there. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was exhaustion, imagination running wild. But the footsteps hadn't stopped. They circled the truck, fading in one moment and crunching just beyond my window the next. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles ached. I wanted to drive, to put distance between myself and the hollow, but the mud on the road made me hesitate. One wrong move and I'd be stuck. The thought of being stranded with whatever was out there made my stomach knot, but I couldn't stay either. I had to move. When I finally mustered the courage to start the engine, it protested violently, coughing and rattling as though resisting. The headlights flickered to life, painting the forest in harsh, white light that cut through the shadows in jagged, fleeting glimpses. I kept my eyes on the road, but out of the corner of my vision, I saw movement again, shadowy shapes darting between trees, always just beyond full visibility, always gone when I tried to focus on them. I swallowed hard and told myself it was my imagination, the way storms play tricks, how wet roads and darkness bend the mind. But the sound of wet leaves under heavy, careful footsteps wouldn't let me forget. As I slowly inched forward, the wind and rain whipped across the windshield, the truck's wipers flailing in an endless battle against the storm. Each flash of lightning illuminated shapes in the woods that made my heart stop. The outlines of figures crouched, leaning, watching. They weren't moving in ways an animal would. I thought of the old stories my grandfather used to tell about the hollow, how people who wandered too far after dark sometimes didn't come back, or came back changed, silent, and hollow-eyed. I had always laughed it off. Now, with my hands gripping the wheel until the veins ached, I understood the weight of those stories. Somewhere, deep in the hollow, a branch snapped loudly, too deliberate to be random. My pulse jumped, and I felt the cold press of panic tracing my spine, creeping along my ribs and pooling in my gut. I tried to keep moving, but every stretch of road revealed something new. Twisted shapes of fallen trees, glimpses of white against the dark, wet trunks that seemed to slither away whenever I looked directly at them. My mind was telling me it was nothing, but my body refused to believe it. The hollow had a rhythm, and I wasn't part of it. I was an intruder. Hours, or maybe only minutes, passed in the slow crawl of the truck through the hollow, the storm a constant oppressive presence. My eyes burned from straining against the darkness, my hands cramped from holding the wheel so tightly. Every flash of lightning revealed more. Figures crouched near the side of the road, shapes blending into the trees, watching, waiting. I told myself I was losing it, that the storm and exhaustion were bending reality, but the sound of wet leaves shifting under feet. My own imagination couldn't mimic that, kept me tethered to fear that felt as real as the steering wheel under my hands. Finally, I saw it. The faint glow of a house in the distance, lights flickering through the rain. Relief surged so strongly I almost cried, and I pushed the truck harder, tires spinning in the mud. But the hollow wasn't done with me. Just before I left the deepest part of the forest, a shape darted across the road. I slammed the brakes, heart hammering, and for a fleeting moment, lightning illuminated a hunched figure, taller than a man, its features hidden, just a dark outline against the storm. It didn't run. It waited. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it melted into the darkness. When I finally reached the road that led out of the hollow and the distant lights of the next town, I dared to breathe. My hands shook violently, and my legs were weak from sitting in the truck for so long, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Even then, I glanced back at the hollow, and for a brief moment, it felt like the darkness was staring back, like the forest itself was aware I had seen too much. I told myself I would never drive through that hollow after dark again. I never have, but even now, years later, the memory clings to me. Storms still make me uneasy, the way rain sounds against leaves and mud under tires. I think about the shapes, the sounds, the air so thick it felt almost alive. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear wet leaves crunching outside my window, even in the quiet of my own home. The hollow didn't just scare me, it followed me. A reminder that some parts of the forest are meant to stay undisturbed. I don't know what I saw, or if it was even alive in the way I understand life. But I know the fear was real, the waiting figures real enough to haunt me, and the hollow. The hollow is still out there, watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to drive its winding, lonely roads after dark. I haven't returned, and I don't plan to. The memory is enough to keep me on the main roads, under the safety of streetlights, away from the suffocating black of that living storm. I think about the hollow sometimes when storms come rolling in, and I can feel it pressing down even through the miles. I can still hear the crunch of wet leaves beneath unseen feet, and sometimes I wonder if I was lucky, or if the hollow has marked me, carrying a shadow of that night wherever I go. Even now, when a thunderclap cracks the sky and lightning flashes against the trees, I feel the cold, creeping weight on my chest. I close my eyes and see the shapes vanish, just as I look, hear the soft crunch of footsteps on wet leaves, and feel my own pulse hammering against the hollow, reminding me that some places in Appalachia are not just roads and forests, but living things, patient and waiting, ready to remind you that the dark is older than your courage. I never stayed in that hollow after dark again. I never will.